Help us cross the 1K mark today. One tap on subscribe means the world to this channel. A flag goes up 100 times a day over a strip of Gulf coastline smaller than the state of New Jersey. And every time it does, it's telling a story about who built the place underneath it. The story goes like this. Nomads crossed out of the central Arabian desert in the early 1700s, found a natural harbor, built a small fort, and became a nation. One migration, one bloodline, one founding. Except a genome study run out of the country's own National Research Institute found something the founding story never accounted for. Not one population under that flag. Three genetically distinct groups, sorted out with enough statistical confidence that researchers could match a person's DNA cluster to their family surname with a level of precision normally reserved for paternity tests. And one of those three clusters carries a genetic signature that has no business being there if the one migration story is true. A signature pointing not across a desert but across an ocean, to a coastline more than 1,000 miles away. So if the founding story of your nation only accounts for one of your three ancestries, which two did you inherit that nobody told you about? The account most people know is a tidy one, and it isn't wrong so much as incomplete. In the early to mid-1700s, a confederation of families known as the Bani Utub left the Nejd, the arid central plateau of the Arabian Peninsula, and moved toward the coast. Among them were the families that would become the ruling and merchant houses of the region. The Al-Sabah, the Al-Khalifa, the Al-Jalama. They settled at a site the locals called Kut, a small fort, built around one of the few natural harbors on that stretch of coastline. From that harbor grew a pearling and Dow trading economy that would, by the late 1800s, make this one of the wealthiest small port towns on the Gulf. The national identity that formed around this story leaned hard on genealogy. Tribal descent, nasab, mattered. Citizenship law, social structure, even the historic split between Hadhar, the settled townspeople, and Badu, the tribal Bedouin, all operated within a single frame. This was an Arabian population, descended from Arabian tribes, full stop. Then oil wealth arrived in the 20th century and did what oil wealth does to founding myths. It calcified them. A homogeneous, tribally rooted Arab nation became not just a story but a point of pride, repeated so often it stopped sounding like a claim and started sounding like a fact. No war interrupted that story. No famine interrupted it. No colonizer rewrote it. It survived, largely undisturbed, for nearly 300 years. But the same harbor that built the pearling fortune also built something else, a shipping lane. And shipping lanes don't just move pearls, they move people. The founding story accounts for what arrived by camel. It has considerably less to say about what arrived by Dow. Here is where it gets complicated. In 2013, a team led by geneticist Osama Al-Smadi at the Dasman Diabetes Institute, Kuwait's own national research center, publishing in the journal PLOS One, ran a genome-wide analysis on 572,366 genetic markers collected from 273 Kuwaiti nationals. Think of it as a genetic fingerprint scan across the whole population at once. Not looking for one marker, but hundreds of thousands. Letting statistical clustering sort people into groups based on shared ancestry, the way a fingerprint sorts a crime scene into suspects. The software didn't return one population. It returned three. Researchers labeled them Kuwait P, Kuwait S, and Kuwait B. Kuwait P clustered with Persian ancestry. Families with roots across the water in Iran, historically known in Kuwait as the Ajam community. Kuwait S clustered with the settled, city-dwelling tribes of Saudi Arabian ancestry, the closest genetic match to the official founding story. And Kuwait B clustered with the nomadic, tent-dwelling Bedouin population, supposedly the most authentically Arabian of the three, the bloodline the whole national myth was built to honor. The clustering wasn't loose or speculative. Researchers cross-checked the genetic groups against family surnames and found a statistical concordance so tight, a Mantel test result with a p-value of 0.0001, that in most cases, a person's last name alone could predict which genetic cluster they belonged to. Three groups, not one. And the concordance between DNA and family name meant this wasn't sampling noise. It was structure. Real, historical, load-bearing structure. Then came the detail that undid the myth from the inside. A follow-up whole genome sequencing project out of the same institute took a single genome from the Kuwait B group, the purest, most tent-dwelling, most Bedouin-coded cluster in the entire study, and sequenced it at high depth. What they found inside that genome was roughly 17% African ancestry. Not the Persian cluster, not some separate, unexplained fourth group quietly admixed in from the coast. The Bedouin cluster, the one the founding story treats as the untouched original bloodline of the nation. Researchers tied the signal to historic nomadic movement across the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula in North Africa. Old, layered, generations deep, clean, expected. That's what the myth promised the Bedouin genome would look like. It didn't. Researchers are careful to frame this as a population-level pattern rather than a verdict on any individual family. Genetic clustering describes averages in history, not personal identity. But averaged across an entire subgroup, 17% is not a rounding error, it is a signature. And it sits inside the one cluster the founding story insisted was the real one. So the group built to represent Arabian purity turns out to be, genetically, the most diluted of the three. While the Persian cluster, the one most visibly foreign to the national story, is at least the one piece of this puzzle that has an explanation on the record. Because there is an explanation for Kuwait. Persian origin families settled along this coast in successive waves tied to centuries of Gulf trade, some arriving over 200 years ago, others as recently as the early 20th century oil boom, drawn by the same economic engine that built the ports. Some demographic estimates place the modern Ajam community at somewhere around 10 to 15% of the citizen population, though the precise figure and its sourcing vary depending on which count you trust and when it was taken. The first theory, the mainstream one, says this cluster is simply the genetic record of a well-documented multi-generational migration. Gulf trade routes doing exactly what Gulf trade routes have always done, moving families back and forth across a narrow stretch of water for 3 centuries running. It's a tidy explanation. It accounts for the Persian signal cleanly, ties it to known migration waves, known trade history, known naturalization patterns stretching back generations. What it does not explain, what it cannot explain, is the 17% sitting inside the Bedouin cluster. The Persian bloodline had a paper trail. Ships, trade ledgers, naturalization records, a community with a name everyone already knew to look for. The other signal didn't have any of that, because the story it points to is one this country has spent the better part of a century trying not to tell. The story it points to isn't a mystery in the sense of being unknown, it's a mystery in the sense of being unspoken. Because the second theory doesn't require a new discovery at all. It requires opening a door historians have already documented and simply agreeing to walk through it. The second theory says that 17% didn't arrive by accident, and it didn't arrive in one generation. It arrived on the same ships that made this coastline rich. For roughly a century and a half, this harbor's economy ran on pearls. At its peak in the late 1800s and early 1900s, hundreds of dhows worked these waters every diving season, and the labor that powered that industry, the divers, the haulers, the crews, was drawn in part from enslaved and formerly enslaved populations, sourced through East African coastal trade routes, that connected this stretch of the Gulf to Zanzibar, to the Swahili coast, to ports researchers describe as part of a single, continuous Indian Ocean trading system. Historians of the region are consistent on this point, even where the genetic record is still being filled in. Slavery here wasn't a footnote to the pearling boom, it was a load-bearing part of it. And it didn't end quietly or early. Legal abolition didn't arrive until 1949, making this one of the later abolitions anywhere in the Gulf. What happened to that population afterward is the part national mythology tends to skip. Descendants were absorbed into the wider citizenry over generations, integrated, intermarried, folded into neighborhoods and family networks. But they occupy what researchers studying Gulf identity politics describe, carefully, as an underdocumented position in the national story. Present in the population, largely absent from the history books. Here's the honest limitation, and it matters. Genetic clustering can show you that admixture happened. It cannot, on its own, tell you exactly when, in how many separate waves, or in what proportions each wave contributed. A follow-up genome analysis from the same Kuwaiti Research Institute described the country's population structure as reflecting recent historical gene flow from Western and Sub-Saharan Africa into the Arabian Peninsula. Real, documented, in the DNA. But researchers are careful to frame the precise timeline as still an open question, not a settled one. And here is the detail that undoes something even Theory 1 left standing. The original 2013 study didn't just find 3 clean separate boxes. When researchers looked closely at the surname-matched Bedouin cluster, the one already carrying that 17% African signal, they also found faint traces bleeding across the other 2 groups. Small threads of Persian ancestry inside the Bedouin cluster, small threads of African ancestry inside the Persian cluster, not the tidy three-box diagram a founding myth would want. Something closer to three overlapping circles that had been touching each other for longer than anyone dated. No cluster in this population turns out to be as sealed as the national story needed it to be. The third theory, and it's the one most researchers are hesitant to say out loud, because it can't yet be tested, reaches back further than any pearling ledger or migration record. This stretch of coastline isn't just a 1700 settlement site. An island a short sail from the harbor, Failaka, carries archaeological layers going back to the Bronze Age, tied to the ancient trading civilization of Dilmun and its Mesopotamian trade partners. If ancient populations moved through this exact stretch of coast thousands of years before the Bani Utub ever crossed the Nejd, is it possible some faint ancestral signal in the modern population predates the entire founding story by millennia? Nobody can answer that yet. No large-scale ancient DNA study has sequenced burial remains from Failaka and compared them against the genomes of modern citizens. Until someone does, this stays exactly where it belongs. Flagged, plausible, and completely unproven. Picture the deck of a purling dhow at first light, sometime in the first decade of the 1900s, anchored just off this same harbor. The air already carries heat before the sun clears the water. A dive captain, the Nakhoda, calls out orders in Gulf Arabic to a crew that doesn't answer back in one language. Some words in Persian, some in Swahili-inflected Arabic, some in the trade pidgin that let a mixed crew function as one unit for months at sea. Divers strip down, tie nose clips carved from turtle shell or bone, and drop on a single rope weighted with stone, holding their breath for a minute or more at a time, sometimes 20, 30, 50 times a day, surfacing with a woven bag of oyster shells and blood sometimes trailing from burst eardrums. Above them, haulers, often the older or more senior men, pull the ropes and manage the count. The hierarchy on board is economic before it's anything else. Captains and financiers at the top, divers carrying the physical risk at the bottom, debt binding many of them to the boat season after season, regardless of where their grandfathers were born. Onshore, the town itself is built from coral stone and gypsum plaster, its walls the exact color of the shallows it faces. Nobody on that deck is thinking about population genetics. But three ancestries are standing on those same planks, breathing the same air, hauling the same ropes. 100 years before a laboratory would need a genome sequencer to prove they'd been there all along. Here's where the frame finally breaks. Every version of this story so far has treated the founding narrative as basically true, just missing a chapter. Bedouin nation plus a Persian community that arrived later, plus an African-descended population that arrived later still. But that's not what the genetic and historical record actually supports when you put it all together. The population wasn't pure and then diluted in stages. It was compound from the beginning. The maritime economy that built this place, the pearling, the dhow trade, the position at the literal geographic hinge between Africa, Persia, and Arabia, didn't add diversity to an existing pure population after the fact. It generated a mixed population from the first working generations of the settlement. Because a coastal trade hub cannot function any other way, national identity and genetic identity split apart for a specific, almost bureaucratic reason. Citizenship law and tribal genealogy, nasab, were built to sort belonging along legal and political lines. Who counted as a founding family, who held nationality rights, who sat inside the recognized tribal structure. None of that was ever designed to track biological ancestry. It was designed to track status. So the African and Persian threads running through the population were never actually hidden from the DNA. They were only ever hidden from the paperwork. Not lost, filed elsewhere. A geneticist working on Gulf population studies once described opening one of these citizen genome files as feeling less like discovering something new and more like finally reading a document that had been sitting in a drawer the whole time, complete, waiting. Nothing about the ancestry was a secret from the body. It was only ever a secret from the archive. This is not unique to one small country on one small stretch of coastline. Nearly every nation with a clean founding myth is, underneath the surface, running the same operation. A simplified story of one people, one origin, laid over the top of a genetically messier reality that trade, conquest, and migration always produce. Most nations never get their population sequenced closely enough for anyone to prove it. This one did, almost by accident, because a diabetes institute needed clean genetic baselines for its medical research and stumbled into a national identity question instead. The data will keep getting more precise. The timelines on the African and Persian migrations will likely sharpen with future sequencing. But no amount of additional data is going to hand this country back a single clean bloodline, because that bloodline never existed to begin with. The myth wasn't a lie so much as an edit. 3 rivers, quietly folded down into the shape of one. Because the Kuwaiti were never who we thought, and the DNA isn't finished telling the truth. It's only just started being asked the question,